is the first of two presentations about verbs, which are incredibly important to good syntax or sentence structure, essentially. This presentation will focus on verbs in terms of agreement, so how they agree with their subjects and how they agree in terms of tense, past, present, future, and the other more complex tenses tucked into the English language. So to begin, the basic rules of agreement are that verbs must agree both with their subjects in terms of whether they are singular or plural, and also in terms of time. The basic principle for singular-plural agreement is that if a subject is singular, the verb is typically singular, and if a subject is plural, the verb is usually plural. Of course, being English, there are numerous exceptions, which we'll discuss today, as well as tricky cases that might confuse you, which we'll also go over. And one of the tricky facts is that while plural nouns usually end in the letter S to make them plural, singular nouns do not end in the letter S. Singular verbs typically end in S, while plural verbs typically do not end in S. So it's sort of the inverse if you think about it that way. So the plural, they collect water samples from the river, versus she collects water samples from the river. Most of you watching today probably know that, but it is one of those things that can trip you up and to be aware of. And the major exception to that singular noun, singular verb, plural noun, plural verb rule is that first and second person typically use plural verbs. So while we would say, I research water conservation, if we're talking about a third person, she or he, for example, we would say she researches water conservation. And by the same token, if we're using second person, which is you, we would say you recommend fewer water diversions versus he recommends fewer water diversions. So this can be a little bit confusing and something to look out for if you know that you struggle with subject-verb agreement. But there are some cases in terms of to-be verbs, which are essentially is, are, have been, if we're talking about the past participle, was for past tense. Sometimes first person uses singular to-be verbs just to make matters even more confusing. And this is a chart that goes over which essentially singular, plural, to-be verb the various persons use. So you might want to take a picture of this slide or download the presentation and print out this picture and keep it near your computer while you're writing if you know this is something you struggle with. But we know that the first person uses am for present tense and was for past tense. So in terms of past tense, it aligns, first person aligns with third person. But we know that with past participle, first person aligns with plural. So instead of has been, I has been, it would be I have been. Luckily, with the future tense, we're looking at the same to-be verb for all pronouns. Similarly, with you, you does not have the exception with to-be verbs, so you are the same as plurals. We are, they are, for example. And also plural verb for to-be for you, were, and plural as well for past participle, have been. And then alternatively, we have third person singular pronouns, he, she, it, use singular to-be verbs throughout. So is, was, has been. And then our plural pronouns do not have an exception. They use plural to-be verbs. So the real complex one here is first person, and you just want to keep in mind which to-be verbs it uses depending on which tense, and make sure you're using it correctly. So if you just remember that first and second person are irregular, and that first person is even more irregular than second person, that should help you, especially in editing your paper. Sometimes it's easy to write the wrong thing in a first draft, but when you're going back, be really cognizant of these exceptions. So while we just discussed to-be verbs, I want to go off on a little tangent about how you might avoid to-be verbs. So we'll talk about active and passive voice at a later point, but a lesser version of using passive voice is the fact that to-be verbs sometimes make us use more words than are really necessary and draw us away from action-oriented verbs. So essentially a to-be verb, which is, are, have been, will be, means basically to exist or occur. So it's a pretty passive verb. It's just existence. It's not the subject actually doing something active or causing something. And so typically they tend to increase wordiness. For example, I have been researching water diversions. This implies that you are still researching water diversions, so you can just say, I research water diversions, research being your main active verb here. So there are places and times for to be verbs. For example, if you are trying to identify yourself as a student, you might say, I am a student at the University of Utah right now. That would be an appropriate use of a to be verb. But if it's unnecessary and you can just use another verb that is more action-oriented, that is preferable. So just a couple other examples of how we might translate to be verbs into active verbs. The government is who needs to fix the problem versus the government should fix the problem. So in this case, we're replacing the to be verb is, which precedes a complex phrase here, who needs to. Just say the government should fix the problem, replacing a modal verb. And modal verbs we will talk about in the second presentation on verbs. So this might make more sense after watching that as well. Another example, regulations have been effective in holding corporations accountable for environmental impacts. As you can see, this is somewhat of a wordy sentence. Instead, we could just say regulations effectively hold corporations accountable. That just helps us improve our concision. So just look out for that in your revision process especially. So now we're going to go over some tricky cases of subject-verb agreement, as well as a few more exceptions. So one tricky case that might trip you up is when the subject and the verb are separated by a phrase. And this, the hard thing about this is that when you're proofreading or when you're writing, you aren't associating the subject and verb necessarily together because there's some words in between. So it's harder to catch when you make a mistake. So an example would be one of those rivers. So one is essentially our subject, one of those rivers, has or have declined significantly. So this is confusing because you might mistake the subject as rivers, which is obviously plural, when the real subject is actually one, so one river. So you want to make sure that you're identifying the true subject in the sentence. And of course, one is a singular noun and therefore requires a singular verb. So one of those rivers has declined significantly. Another example, the people who reside in Hyderabad are often threatened by floods. Again, you might get confused about whether the subject is the people, which is a plural subject, a plural noun, or Hyderabad, the city, which is a singular noun. So you want to make sure that you're really getting at the right subject when you pick your verb. Another case of confusion is when we have multiple subjects. And subjects can be associated with each other with and or, for example. So if we have two subjects joined with the word and, then we have multiple subjects or a plural subject, and therefore we need a plural noun. So Bugra and Smith, these are two authors, state that the results are inconclusive, state being our plural verb. But if the subjects are joined by an or, then we need a singular verb because truly the subject is one or the other, not both. So a biologist or an ecologist has, for our singular verb, the potential to add a new perspective to our research. If it were a biologist and an ecologist, then we would have as our verb there. Another tricky case are indefinite pronouns. So these are words that refer to sort of vague groups of people that we often use when we make generalized statements about conditions or issues. So everybody, somebody, anybody, everyone. And while these obviously in some cases refer to plural people, multiple people, they are all singular. They all require singular verbs. So we don't want everyone does homework, as in he does homework, a singular subject. We want everyone, so everyone is our singular subject, so everyone does homework. Where on the flip side, students, which is a plural noun, requires a plural verb, do their homework. So even though everyone could refer to a group of students, we treat it as a singular case. So everyone does homework versus students do homework. somebody does homework, anybody does homework, everyone does homework. All of these require singular verbs. And another tricky case is collective pronouns. So we just talked about indefinite pronouns. When we are using collective pronouns to refer to a set amount but unspecified amount of people or things or objects, these are all treated as plural nouns. So all, few, several, both, many, some, these all get plural verbs. So all of them get good grades. Both of you study long hours. So the way to kind of distinguish between these two groups is if it starts with every, some, or any, then everyone, anyone, anybody, all of these are sort of hypothetical. We're talking about singular nouns and verbs. Versus if it's an amount that could be potentially counted, all, few, several, and it doesn't start with every, some, or any, then these require plural verbs. So now we're going to talk a little bit about tenses. So verbs have to align with their subjects, as we discussed with singular and plural versions of our nouns, but they also need to make sense in terms of tense. So sometimes this can be hard to catch, but here's an incorrect version of a verb aligning with tense. So the city floods when the levees broke. What is wrong with this sentence? So the second clause in the sentence, when the levees broke, is in the past, right? We know that at some point in the past, levees broke. But the city floods is in the present. And this could be describing something that is happening at the very moment or something that sort of happens routinely, like the city floods when this happens. But the condition of the city flooding doesn't make sense to say that it's happening right now when the levees are breaking in the past tense. So we either need to put both in the past tense or both in the present tense. So we could say the city flooded when the levees broke, or we could say the city floods when the levees break to describe more of a hypothetical situation. Another place where we often confuse tenses is in lists. So we're going to talk more about parallelism in lists in the module on flow. This is the last module of this course. But we also want to make sure that our lists align in terms of tense. So that means if our list is comprised of a series of verbs, for example, we're doing this, that, and the other, all of those verbs need to be in the same tense. Otherwise, they need to be restructured, essentially. So we collected, labeled, and analyzed the samples. Take a second and think about what's wrong with that. Collected and labeled are verbs in the past tense, whereas analyze is a verb in the present tense. So we either need to have all of these verbs in the past or the present. We can correct it by saying we collected, labeled, and analyzed the samples, or we collect, label, and analyze the samples. And if the two first items in the list did happen in the past and the third is happening in the present, then we can restructure the sentence to say we collected and labeled the samples and now we are analyzing the samples or analyzing them. That would be a way to correct this as well if there is a difference in tenses in truth. But it would need to be restructured not just as a simple list like this. So this is a shorter presentation, but you might want to review it a couple times to remind yourself of the exceptions and the tricky cases that do arise when we talk about subject-verb agreement. And hopefully some of the exercises will allow you to practice applying these concepts.